Your attic could be hotter than an oven, and every degree is forcing your air conditioner to work harder. Most homeowners don't realize what's quietly draining their money every summer. Just across the road, Amish families have kept their homes noticeably cooler for generations, without expensive equipment or higher electric bills. The strangest part isn't what they spend. It's the tiny piece hidden on the roof that most modern homes no longer have. And once you know why, you'll never look at your attic the same way again. The attic in my house hit 94 degrees yesterday afternoon. I know because I keep a small thermometer up there, nailed to a rafter since 1987. Down the road, at my English neighbor's place, his attic was reading 138. He told me that himself, standing in his driveway, wiping his face with a rag, while a truck from the air conditioning company idled behind him. That visit cost him $210. Mine cost me nothing, because I haven't called anyone about my attic in over 20 years. His house is 11 years old. Mine is older than I am. And yet on the hottest day of July, his air conditioner runs from noon until nearly midnight, just to keep his bedrooms livable. While my wife and I sleep under a quilt some nights, even in August, because the upstairs stays cool enough to need one. My name is Elias Stoltzfus. I am Amish. By the end of this, you will know exactly what my father taught me about a roof, what it costs to do it yourself, which is under $5 in most cases, and why the difference between his attic and mine has almost nothing to do with insulation, and almost everything to do with a piece of hardware most modern roofs don't have anymore. Stay with me, because near the end, I'm going to tell you something about your own roof that your insurance company already knows and has never once mentioned to you. It has to do with how long your shingles are actually built to last, and it isn't what's printed on the package. Here's the thing nobody wants to say plainly. The heating and cooling industry doesn't need a meeting room and a conspiracy to keep this quiet. Nobody has to coordinate anything. It's simpler than that, and honestly worse. An HVAC company makes its money selling bigger units, more service calls, and more refrigerant. A contractor makes his money installing insulation, which is a real and useful thing. Don't get me wrong. But it treats the wrong end of the problem in a lot of houses. Nobody in that chain benefits from telling you that a $5 piece of louvered metal installed correctly does more for your attic temperature than 8 inches of extra fiberglass. So nobody tells you. It's not a plot. It's just a quiet agreement, and it happens because everybody stays quiet and everybody keeps making money. The National Roofing Contractors Association has published guidance on attic ventilation ratios since the 1970s, and it's public information. It's just not information anyone profits from repeating to you. I want to say something else about this, because it's easy to hear quiet agreement and think I'm accusing anyone of dishonesty. I'm not. Most contractors I've worked alongside over the years, English and otherwise, are decent men doing decent work. But a man who makes his living installing insulation isn't thinking about ridge vents any more than a man who fixes clocks is thinking about the price of shoes. He does what he was trained to do, sells what he was trained to sell, and the system just quietly moves along that way, generation after generation, without a single person needing to lie to you directly. That's what makes it harder to see than an actual conspiracy would be. A conspiracy gets found out eventually. A quiet agreement just becomes the way things are done, until nobody remembers there was ever another way. Now here's the actual mechanism, and it's not complicated once somebody explains it plainly. Hot air rises. You already know that. What you might not know is that a closed attic acts almost exactly like a chimney with the damper shut. The sun beats down on your shingles all day, That heat soaks through the roof deck and it has nowhere to go. It just sits up there, baking the underside of your roof, your insulation, your ductwork, if you've got it running through the attic, and eventually it pushes down into the living space below. Builders call this the stack effect, which is just a fancy way of describing how hot air naturally wants to rise and escape through the highest point available. You don't need to remember that term. Just remember this. Your attic needs a top and a bottom, an intake down low and an exhaust up high. The same way a good wood stove needs air coming in at the bottom and smoke going out at the top, or it just smolders and fills the room with heat that has nowhere to go. I'll be honest with you, this isn't magic, and it won't turn a poorly built attic into an igloo. If your soffits are painted shut, or your insulation is blocking the intake vents, none of this works the way it should until that's fixed first. There's no trick that gets around bad airflow at the intake. There's a second part of the science worth understanding, because it explains why some houses seem to suffer worse than others, even with similar roofs. Dark shingles absorb more heat than light ones, sometimes reaching roof surface temperatures 50 or 60 degrees hotter than the surrounding air on a sunny day. That heat doesn't stay on the surface. It transfers downward through the roof deck by conduction, the same way a cast iron skillet left on a stove gets hot all the way through, not just on the bottom touching the flame. Also, a dark, shingled roof with poor ventilation is fighting two problems at once: more heat coming in from the sun, and no way for that heat to leave once it's inside the attic. A ridge vent doesn't change how much heat your shingles absorb. It only changes what happens to that heat once it's trapped up there. That's an important distinction, because if someone tells you ventilation alone will make your roof stop absorbing sun in the first place, they're overselling it. What it does is give that trapped heat somewhere to go, instead of pushing down into your bedrooms. What my father used, and what I still use on every building I put a roof on, is called a ridge vent, paired with proper soffit vents at the eaves. Now here's where people go wrong, and I see it on English houses all the time when I'm doing roofing work for hire. They'll buy what's called a static roof vent, one of those little metal or plastic dome-shaped things you see poking up near the peak, thinking that's the same as a proper ridge vent. It is not the same thing. A single static vent covers maybe a 50 to 100 square foot area of attic space around it. A continuous ridge vent, run the full length of the roof peak, works with the wind itself, using the pressure difference created when wind passes over the ridge to actively pull hot air out along the entire roof line, not just one spot. That's the correct grade, so to speak. The wrong type is the single mushroom vent people slap on because it's cheap and quick. The right type is a continuous ridge vent strip, which you'll find at any real lumber yard or hardware store, usually running about $4 to $8 for a 3-foot section, meaning a typical ridge line can be vented for well under the cost of one HVAC service call. The way you do this yourself, if your roof doesn't already have one, starts with cutting a gap along the peak of your roof on both sides of the ridge board, about 2 inches wide on each side. That's the opening the hot air will escape through. This is not something you do carelessly, and if you've never been on a roof before, this is exactly the kind of job where you bring someone experienced, because a mistake here means a leak, and a leak is a much bigger problem than a hot attic. Once that gap is cut, you lay the ridge vent material over it, nail it down along both edges according to the spacing printed right on the product, and cap it with a ridge shingle to match the rest of your roof. So from the ground it just looks like a slightly raised cap along the peak. Nothing unusual. Down at the bottom of the roof, at the eaves, you need those soffit vents clear and open, because the ridge vent only works if air can come in low and push the hot air out high. Most people get this part wrong. They'll install a beautiful ridge vent and never check whether the soffits underneath are actually open, and half the time they're painted shut, stuffed with insulation, or covered entirely with old blown-in fiberglass that was never meant to reach that far. A ridge vent with no working soffit intake is like opening the flue on a wood stove but keeping the door shut. It does almost nothing. The whole job, cutting the ridge gap, installing the material, capping it, and clearing the soffits, takes an experienced person about half a day on an average-sized roof, and materials for a typical house run somewhere between $40 and $80 total for the ridge vent strips. Though the concept itself, the actual principle once you understand taught me, costs nothing at all once you understand it. That $5 I mentioned in the title refers to the cost per linear section of vent material, which is close to what my father paid decades ago, adjusted for what a small hardware store still charges today for the basic aluminum strip version, before markup from bigger suppliers. One more detail worth mentioning while we're talking materials. Some hardware stores will try to sell you a plastic ridge vent instead of the aluminum or galvanized steel version. The plastic ones are cheaper up front, sometimes by half, but they tend to become brittle after years of sun exposure, especially in hotter climates, and I've seen them crack along the nail line within 8 or 10 years. The metal version costs a little more, but tends to outlast the shingles themselves. If you're doing this once and want it to last, spend the extra $1 or $2 per section and get the metal. Now, I want to be honest with you, because I won't tell you this fixes every hot house, and that would be a lie if I did. If you live somewhere with very little wind, this system depends partly on natural airflow, and it works less dramatically on dead calm days, though the stack effect from rising hot air still helps even without wind. If your house has a very low slope roof, under about a 3-12 pitch, a ridge vent isn't always effective or even installable correctly, and you'd need a different solution, sometimes powered fans, sometimes a different vent placement entirely. And if your attic insulation is old, compressed, or has gaps, ventilation alone won't make up for that. It'll help, sometimes a great deal, but it isn't a replacement for insulation that's doing its job. I've seen attics drop 15 to 25 degrees after proper ridge, and soffit ventilation was corrected, but I've also seen houses where the improvement was more modest, closer to 8 or 10 degrees, because other factors were working against it. Anyone who tells you a $5 trick turns your attic into a walk-in cooler is selling you something, and I am not selling you anything. I'll add one more honest limitation while I'm at it. If your house already has a whole house fan or powered attic fan installed, adding a ridge vent on top of that can sometimes work against the powered fan rather than with it, because the two systems can end up fighting for the same air instead of cooperating. If you've got a powered fan already, it's worth asking someone who understands both systems before you add a ridge vent on top, rather than assuming more airflow solutions automatically stacked together the way more insulation might. My father taught me this the summer I turned 13. We were re-roofing my uncle's barn, and I remember complaining about the heat, the way boys do, and he stopped hammering, sat back on his heels, and told me something his own father had told him. He said, "A roof that can't breathe will smother a house, the same way a wool coat with the collar buttoned up in July will smother a man." He wasn't a man who explained things twice, so I remember it exactly that way, in his voice, with the smell of hot cedar shingles and pine tar in the air around us. Oh, my grandmother used to say something similar about her kitchen, that a house needed to breathe the way a person does, in through one place and out through another, or everything inside it would go stale, the air, the heat, even the mood of the people living under it. She learned that from her mother, who kept the family through winters without a single dollar spent on heating oil, not because they were poor, though they were, but because they understood how a house actually worked, instead of just paying someone else to fight against it every season. Stepping back from just my attic and yours, this is a bigger pattern than most people realize. The average American household now spends somewhere close to $2,000 a year on cooling and heating combined, and a meaningful portion of that, some estimates put it near 30%, is lost fighting inefficiencies that proper ventilation and basic building sense use to prevent for free. That's not a small number when you multiply it across tens of millions of homes. It isn't that this knowledge was forgotten by accident. It was pushed aside, slowly over decades, by an economy that makes more money when you call someone else to fix a problem than when you understand how to prevent it yourself. Nobody stole it from you in one dramatic moment. It just quietly stopped getting passed down, generation by generation, until people forgot their grandparents ever knew it at all. So here is your plan for the weekend, plain and simple. First, go up into your attic on a hot afternoon and just feel it. Notice the temperature. Notice whether there's any airflow at all near the peak. Second, check your soffits from outside. Look underneath the eaves and see if those vents are actually open and clear, not painted over, not blocked with insulation. Third, if you don't have a proper ridge vent, price it out at a real lumber yard, not a big chain if you can help it, and consider whether this is a job you can do yourself safely or one where you bring in someone experienced, because roof work is not the place to guess. Tell me in the comments where you live and how hot your attic actually gets in the summer. I read every one of them, and I'm always curious how different this looks in different climates. And next time, I want to tell you about something my wife's grandmother did with her roof shingles themselves, using a specific mineral compound most people have never heard of, that added years onto a roof's life without spending a dime on replacement, something the shingle manufacturers know perfectly well and print nowhere on the bag. Until then, check your soffits and get up in that attic before the next heat wave hits. And remember the people who built this country with their hands, new things we are only just starting to remember.